Well, good evening, everyone, and you are very welcome to the Trinity Long Room Hub, our Institute for the Arts and Humanities. There are some seats at the front, just in the front row. No one ever takes the front row, but you are all VIPs here, so you're all very welcome at the front if you would like. My name is Patrick Gagan. I'm the director of the Institute, and we're delighted to be able to welcome you all for our third Behind the Headlines of the year. But it's actually the first one that I've chaired because two of our wonderful colleagues, David Kenny and Lindsay Byrne, chaired the first two, but I'm delighted to be able to chair this one. And I would also like to say that Behind the Headlines is made possible thanks to a very generous endowment from the John Pollard Foundation, and we are very grateful to them for all of their support over the many years. We have a wonderful expert panel. I'll introduce them starting on my left. We have Professor Dan Geary, who is a colleague of mine in history. He is the Mark Pigott Professor of American History, and he is, as well as being a distinguished scholar, a notable commentator on events happening in the United States and around the world in national and international media. And we're always very grateful and delighted for his perspectives. Behind him, we have the founding director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, Professor Paul Home, who's Professor of Environmental History. And what I'm especially proud of is that in the last 4 months, we've had every single director of the hub in, I think, twice for different events. Professor Jürgen Barkov in for events around the European presidency and the 250th anniversary of modern languages. Professor Eve Patton was at our coffee morning just on Tuesday and has been in for other events. Professor Jane Olmar has been in at many events, including our event on the 2013 presidency before Christmas. And wonderful to have Professor Paul Home because he was at a wonderful event with His Excellency, the Danish Ambassador to Ireland, Lars Thuesen, and we're delighted to welcome him back for his second visit to Trinity as well in recent months. And delighted to have him here because we had a wonderful event before Christmas on Denmark's presidency of the Council of the EU. And of course, Ireland takes over that presidency on the 1st of July. And we had a meeting about it in Trinity just on Wednesday. And everyone was saying how well Denmark had done it. And Denmark appears to be the model for a successful presidency. And we were trying to learn the lessons of how it went so well. So that was, it's a brilliant honor to have you back. Beside Paul, we have Mairéad McGuinness, who is a former European Commissioner, former Vice President of the European Parliament, and is currently a Vice President of the EPP, the European People's Party. And we're also delighted to welcome guests from the EPP, and you are very welcome to Trinity and to Dublin tonight. And then beside Mairéad, we have Professor Michael Becker, who's an expert on international law and lectures in the School of Law here in Trinity College Dublin. And again, a brilliant commentator on some of those international legal dimensions of what's going on around the world. Tonight's discussion is on Greenland, Venezuela, and the New World Order. It is going to be a panel discussion between me and our guests, but we are going to begin with a reflection from Mairéad McGuinness about, maybe her thoughts on the state of the world, Greenland, Venezuela, the New World Order, and maybe the challenges that they pose to Europe. So we will start off by inviting Mairéad McGuinness to the podium.
So thank you very much for the invitation. And it's great to see a full house and everything starts on time. I said recently on radio that no is a full sentence, except when Patrick asks you to say yes. So I'm here because I attended an event some months ago, which I thought was really good and really interesting. I'd rather be in the audience because I think I have a lot to learn from the experts, but I run through a few thoughts with you. One of the things that I really want to compliment the Trinity College is that you're having these discussions, because a lot of what we have today in terms of debate are not discussions. They're your view and his view, and they clash all the time, and they don't inform, and they don't allow people to change their minds. And that's a topic that troubles me in politics generally, and I'm not actively involved as an elected representative. As I said, the experts will do the expert stuff. I mean, the amount of headlines that we've read in the last year that were beyond dramatic and shocking is incredible. In fact, the headline writers had no work to do. because they were just made for them. And as somebody who was in journalism for 24 years prior to my 20 years in the European institutions, I mean, some of the language in the discourse is also more coarse than I would have ever experienced in journalism over that time. There were issues, obviously, security and defense, and that will, I'm sure, be a big discussion here, but trade and tariffs, technology, AI, and European regulation. And then we've had the horrors of war, Ukraine, Gaza, and other parts of the world where horrors are happening that get no headlines at all. And I think that's also quite troubling. So you're going to talk about Venezuela and Greenland, and I just, mention them later in my few words. One observation I have is that the European Union, we are our worst and harshest critics. We're always giving out about Europe. It either does too much or it doesn't do enough. And I think we should really occasionally stop and think of what we are, how strong we are, how wealthy we are, how capable we are and have been of dealing with crisis, rather than panicking about every headline that we read. And I'm worried a little because, it gets into the psyche, not just of citizens, but of politicians as well. If you read the headlines and if you respond to them, and some of them have been incredibly provocative, then you go down a spiral that really doesn't allow you to take the necessary action. So I think we need to recall things like how we dealt with COVID, how we dealt with the war in Ukraine, how we responded and gave support to Ukraine. So we are strong when we have to be. And I think if we don't recall our capacities to be strong, then we will be weakened by those who seek to weaken us. And there are many. Because what we have, including the freedom to stand here and exchange views and have different opinions, is something that many citizens globally do not have and may never have. And maybe we need to reflect on the value of that and how we could harness it to strengthen the European Union. We're not the United States. We're the European Union. And while we do compare ourselves, we need to be careful about how far that goes. I was looking at some comments that Paul Krugman made, and he was saying that, when it comes to things like life expectancy, wealthy Americans live shorter lives on average than ordinary EU citizens. We do have social welfare safety nets, so we have shorter working weeks, we have longer paid vacations, and I know maybe there will be a discussion about how long can we afford that. But as he pointed out, these are not symptoms of decay. They're outcomes of policy trade-offs, prioritising stability, health, social cohesion, alongside productivity and growth. And if you look at what has happened since the invasion of Ukraine and the energy shocks that followed, we still have had income growth in Europe, and it's largely kept pace with the United States. So what I really want to say is that Europe can be resilient through shocks, and we have ways of dealing with them. Now, I'm not saying that all is rosy, and I'm not saying all of this to say that we don't need to change. But I think we need to sometimes recognise our own capabilities and capacities and reflect on where Europe has come from, and particularly here in Ireland over 50 years. So I didn't vote in the referendum to join, but my parents, long gone, had faith in this concept, not fully knowing where it would evolve, but knew kind of innately that Ireland with countries was better than Ireland on its own. So this new world order, and I'm sure the experts will chart it better than I can because I've been just watching it evolve, it didn't start last year. And I think that's really crucial. We have this idea that suddenly the re-election of President Trump changes everything. It's been evolving over time. And again, when I look back at the COVID crisis, and I was in the Commission at the time, there was a terrible shock because we didn't realise where most of our supplies of goods or supply chains were actually starting and ending. So protective clothing, the very basics, we couldn't get access to because they were being supplied by one major country. So I think what that did, that pandemic and even access to vaccines and producing a vaccine and sharing the vaccine, really was the first jolt for the European economy and the European system and made us think about supply chains. I think Brexit also, because for Ireland in particular, it had supply chain consequences. So this is a long time in the making. again, if you look at how the Commission are responding, I'll quote some lines from the President to frame our debate here in her State of the Union speech in September, where she said very harshly that Europe is in a fight for values, our democracy, our liberty, and our ability to shape our own destiny ourselves. And we are, she said, in a fight for our future in an unforgiving world. Now, we might debate this sentence that Europe's independence moment has arrived. By that, to take care, including of many things, but our security and defence, control over technologies and energies that will fuel the future. Really to decide on what sort of society and economy and democracy that Europe wants to grow into. And we have that freedom and we have the power to determine our own destiny. And I think, again, it goes back to the fact that we have managed in the past to deal with very tough situations. There's an interesting discussion around strategic autonomy and open strategic autonomy. It was when I was in the Commission and indeed in the Parliament, these were terms that were discussed. One would suggest almost a fortress Europe, the other a more open European Union. I think the Irish view is we want open. But I think where the strategic autonomy piece comes in is that on energy, on critical raw materials, we would not be able to sustain our economies unless we can guarantee the supply, safe supply of those components that make for the digital future that we're actually in at the moment. So we do need to think strategically around critical raw materials, and this is indeed why Greenland will definitely be mentioned in that light, including in energy. I mean, our relationship with the United States has changed profoundly, and I think it will continue to change and evolve. But we need to have a relationship with the United States, and they need to have one with us as well. And I don't think it's a time to turn our backs on each other, even though one might be tempted. It will be futile because there are many links and they go back a long, long way. We know that Russia, the war is continuing. There is talk about peace by June. It would be a great hope if that happens. And I hear there's talk even of elections there as well. And then our relationship with China also gives us a lot of challenges, including around their capacity to subsidize overcapacity and impact what's happening in the European economy. I took a debate when I was still in the Commission on the production of solar panels, which Europe was really strong in. And yet over time, in a very short period of time, China took that market and left us vulnerable. So we have really world examples of where strategic issues need to be addressed. And indeed, if you listen to what the Chinese leader speaks about, it's about stability over reform, self-reliance over interdependence, and national resilience in the face of external pressure. So a lot of big players are thinking in that direction. We do have a blueprint for the future. If you've read the Draghi and letter reports, please put your hands up now. But some will have. They're actually very good reports. But I think the problem is we haven't strengthened what we already have. So the European single market is not complete. My biggest frustration when I was Commissioner for Financial Services is that there is no free movement of capital in Europe, despite our existence. We don't have banking union. We don't have a strong capital markets union. We're great savers. We have great innovation in Europe, great startups. And the minute they need to scale up, they go to the US. And we need to address that because we do have the capacity to strengthen our markets. The only trouble is, and I'll say this hand on heart, that when I was a member of the European Parliament, I criticised the Commission at every turn. And then I joined the Commission. And I realised it's not all their fault, even though I read in one editorial today that it is, because in a sense, the Commission is caught between the Parliament and the Member States. They don't always agree internally. And they certainly don't. The Parliament is quite fragmented and the Member States have different views. So that's always a drag on progress until there's a crisis. And I wonder how deep this particular feeling of a crisis has to get before we have full implementation of many of those recommendations that are in those reports. Just briefly a word on security and defence, and I put it in that order, particularly here in Ireland, because I think, again, in my time on finance, my biggest concern was a successful cyber attack on the financial system. That will do more harm than all the weapons of war, because it will disrupt society completely. Imagine that app doesn't work for you anymore, and you don't know what you have or where it's gone. I mean, these are not things of science fiction. This can happen unless we build and continue to build resilience into the system. And the more we digitalize, the more we really have to make sure that our cyber systems and our security around them are really, really very advanced and very strong, because not everyone loves us globally. There are bad actors who would seek to weaken, as I said earlier, the European Union, and they have ways of doing that. And I'm sure that that is not, unfortunately, going to go away. A brief word on trade. Europe is extending the net and doing trade agreements with many partners, India recently, Mercosur, potentially Australia. These aren't easy, both within member states and indeed between various interests. But we do need them. And I think if ever there was a time for us to say, let's try and do trade agreements and get them ratified, up and running, because it builds relationships, it deepens them, and it also helps us to grow and expand in terms of job creation. There is something that troubles me a little about Europe. So we have President Donald Trump, one voice. We had Mark Carney, one voice, making a very strong speech, which everybody did and I'm sure has read, very clear. But they're one voice. I think Europe still, because of the system we have, doesn't have that one strong voice. I wonder, can we get to that place? Although there is resistance, there was a suggestion that we should have a commission and president of in one, so the council and the head of the commission would be one person. A big job, mind you, but it does speak to, in a world where there's so much noise, if every leader is commenting on all issues, it's very hard for even citizens to understand what is the European view on this, what is the European perspective. But what was encouraging about Mark Carney's speech was that he talked about, again, the opportunity for middle powers rather than fear of what's going on. That again, we have the capacity, those of us in that bracket, to come together and collaborate and not to give in to this idea that power and might will decide on everything. My last remarks are, and I felt this for a long time, who gives time for the European Union in terms of our member states? What time do our leaders have to give to the European agenda when so much is happening back home? I mean, I've often been in meetings where you knew that everyone in the room was on their phone, not listening to what I was saying, but concentrating on a problem back home in the capital that had to be dealt with. And I think we're going to have to try and find a way where that's reversed, where leaders, the prime ministers, the presidents, that they give and are allowed the flexibility to give more time to dealing with European issues, because in the long run, that's where all of the problems will be solved. But that requires, I think, more discussion like this with people, either at town hall level, to understand that you need to give permission on these big topics. And maybe now is the time that we do that, because we are under a little bit of pressure with the changing in the world order, because Europe does stand for something, that what we have is worth defending and worth not just protecting as it is, but changing it for the better. Notwithstanding the different views across member states. I mean, I have to say, if I were to choose a place to live, and I'm sure in this room, if I asked you as well, where would you like to live? Europe? Definitely. Why? Because we have the freedoms that we enjoy, and because when you compare it to other places, it actually does a lot for citizens. But it will not, in my view, survive without greater engagement by citizens. And I think here in Ireland, we're old members at this stage. We shouldn't take for granted that Europe will be, because it is. There is nothing guaranteed in terms of political formations. What was created can be destroyed. It can be destroyed by external pressure or internal division. And it's up to those of us who actually believe in the concept of working together. And it's tough. I can tell you, during presidencies, I would have stood at the room at, early hours of the morning when we were trying to agree something and said, no, you're not leaving this room until we get agreement. I was polite, but in other words, these things take time and effort. And I think Europe needs more effort by member states and their leaders. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and a wonderful tour de force there to start off our discussion. And Michael, I'm going to begin with you, and I'm going to begin with Venezuela. because otherwise I think Venezuela might be forgotten about in the discussion, because when our team were planning this event in early January, it was all going to be about Venezuela. And then Greenland became the big topic of discussion. And it almost seems like Venezuela is forgotten about and no one talks about it. And you organized a wonderful event here on the boat strikes. But of course, by the time the event was held, Venezuela had moved on from that because you had had the intervention there, and it kind of shows how quickly everything is moving as well.
Well, I think that's a part and parcel of dealing with the Trump administration, and that every week, if not every day, we have a new crisis to respond to, and that's in fact part of the strategy. So, sure, what's going on in Venezuela now? I can't say I know up to the minute, but it's troubling because we've entered into kind of a stasis where, as far as those of us sitting here know, the U.S. is running Venezuela from afar. What does that mean in practice? Well, this hasn't gone maybe the way people thought it was going to go after the U.S. Carried out this extraordinary abduction of Maduro. They have not tried to work with the Democratic opposition. They have simply allowed the rest of what the U.S. otherwise describes as an illegitimate regime to continue on. And apparently behind closed doors are applying all sorts of pressure so that the decisions that Venezuela makes for itself are in fact the decisions that the Trump administration would have it make. When the operation took place, there was some indication from various commentators or various leaders in Europe that, well, this is troubling. There are very complex legal issues here. The rule of law is very important. That was a very disappointing response, in my view. And I say this as a lawyer who understands that you have to hedge your language all the time. And that's, of course, true in the world of diplomacy as well. But this was an instance where the violations attendant to that operation were so blatant. There was no complexity to it. There are really no complex legal questions about whether what the U.S. did in going into Venezuela, taking out Maduro and his wife, bringing them to New York to face trial. These were blatant violations of the UN Charter, the prohibition on the use of force, territorial integrity. And we see that now extending to the U.S. indirectly, let's say, controlling the natural resources of Venezuela, which is another core principle of international law, that states have sovereignty over their own resources. So where does this leave us? We don't really know. Apparently, the U.S. is running Venezuela from afar. One interesting side note: people maybe won't know about this. There's been a long-running dispute between Venezuela and Guyana, its neighboring state, both oil-rich states, where Venezuela challenges an old 19th century arbitration award that decided the border between these two states. And they say that border, that was a corrupt decision. The border actually should give us something like half of Guyana. And this is a case that this was negotiated for decades and decades, and it finally went to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And it's been working its way through the system there for several years. But the hearing on the merits is now scheduled for May. Who was the agent? So the person who officially represents Venezuela at previous phases of the case, a little known politician named Delcy Rodriguez, who's now, of course, the leader of Venezuela. And I've been wondering who is going to show up as the agent for Venezuela in The Hague. Will it be Marco Rubio?
Just following up on that, we tried in January to find people from Venezuela or Venezuelans living here to come on the panel. And so many refused because they have family back in Venezuela and it wouldn't be safe for them. So you have an old regime that clearly had human rights violations and problems. So does that make it a gray area? I know you're saying that it's not, but it kind of does confuse things a little bit in terms of a regime that clearly had major problems with it being replaced, even if it's not quite replaced.
That's certainly true. The Maduro regime has very few friends, and its friends are not regimes you would probably want to be friends with yourself. But from a legal perspective, from an international legal perspective, that doesn't really matter. So there is no recognized right of unilateral humanitarian intervention, forcible intervention in the face of mass violations of human rights. Now, we could have a discussion. Should that be the rule? Should there be an exception that allows an individual state to decide, or with allies, to go in the face of grave humanitarian atrocities, violations, or to depose an illegitimate, unelected leader, or on other grounds, if a government has destroyed an otherwise valuable economy? Is that grounds to go in and get rid of them because it will benefit lots of people? Those might be good rules, but those aren't the rules we have. And the U.S. could only have done this with authorization of the UN Security Council, or if it was acting in self-defense, and neither of those tests were met in this case.
And the reasons that were being used, like drugs and all of that, were very spurious as well.
Those are all problems, but they don't justify an armed intervention.
Dan, one thing that gets me is that people sometimes see what President Trump is doing as a complete break with the past and with ways of doing things. But we've seen that in American history, going back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, to the Roosevelt Corollary, to even with my students, I was doing John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, and he talks about the Western Hemisphere, and it's not going to suffer anyone messing around with it, and they see it as their sphere. So in a way, in American foreign policy, this is when President Trump speaks about the hemisphere and America having this dominant position, that is echoing language that is there going back a very long time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many cases of the U.S. intervening in Latin America and what people would say are clear violations of international law. You go back to the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile. You go back to what Reagan was doing in Central America in the 1980s. You have the Panama War and the removal of Noriega in the late 80s, and you can just go back, even from there. So, I mean, from the Latin American perspective, I think the idea of a sort of a rule-based international order has always included the U.S. making exceptions when it wanted to. The only real big difference in the case of Trump is just, I suppose, the brazenness of it and the lack of even attempting to justify itself in terms of international law. I mean, they clearly just don't care about that whatsoever. Whereas previously, I mean, yes, the government of Allende was overthrown, but that was the CIA and was meant to be covert, and a lot of Reagan stuff was also meant to be covert, or it was justified, and in certain terms. I mean, this is the Venezuela abduction wasn't even justified in terms of human rights at all. It was there. I think we could talk about there were different factions in the Trump administration who wanted it for different reasons. But Trump mostly talked about just wanting oil, and that's okay. So it's almost going back to like a 19th century imperial mentality of this is our region of the world. And if we want to intervene in our own interests, then we will do it.
And is Trump's foreign policy coherent? Because it seemed to go in a different direction in the first term, and certainly the MAGA movement would have a view that it's America first and that America shouldn't get involved in these international interventions. But already you have Trump intervening in the Middle East, you have him intervening in Venezuela, threatening to intervene in Greenland, threatening to intervene back in Iran. So it's very different from what had kind of been promised to the American people.
Yeah, it's not coherent. You often find this in presidential administrations. You have different factions. I mean, you have, to simplify things, you have the Rubio faction, which is much more kind of neocon. And Rubio, certainly in Latin America, he wants to destroy the Latin American left. He would love for the Cuban regime to fall, and cutting off Venezuelan oil, I think, was the big reason why he wanted to get involved. Then you have J.D. Vance, who is more of an American first type, which doesn't mean that he won't support interventions, but he certainly has no interest in international law or in pleasing allies of any kind. And then Trump himself is He likes big spectacles like the abduction of Maduro. I think he might have thought it would help him politically. It didn't really. And he has fixation on certain resources. And then I think Greenland really, to a very large degree, is being driven by his own personal psychology. He's even said, psychologically, I want to have it. That's what he said. Where there you have like a 19th century mentality, but without even a rational reason, that he thinks if he acquires territory, and you're looking at maps, Greenland looks bigger than it is,
He confuses it with Iceland.
Exactly. So I don't think there's actually many factions, that particularly pushing for that. That seems to be a personal fixation. And at the end of the day, obviously, it is Trump who chooses what policies to follow. So he'll override, anything else anybody wants.
And it is different from the way politicians usually behave, because sometimes a politician might say something, but they actually mean something else. But with Trump, he very often just says the things you're not meant to say out loud, where he wants it for the oil, or he doesn't feel they're getting respect, or he wants to be the president that has his name over buildings, or he wants to be expanding the United States. That very often it's the kind of the unacceptable thing he will say publicly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one thing you could say is that he's not hypocritical. So, maybe it makes us nostalgic for the American hypocrites of before. But
And Paul, talk to us about Greenland then, and maybe its relationship with Denmark, and maybe why you think the United States and Trump, why Trump, not the United, why Trump is fixated on it, and maybe how, maybe there's a perception that Irish people have about Greenland that's maybe shaped by our own history rather than its own relationship with Denmark.
Yeah, I think in an Irish context, it's really important to just realize that Ireland and its relationship with Britain is not the same as Greenland with Denmark. It's very different in so many contexts. And of course, Greenland's population is quite small, 57,000 people. A third of these are actually ethnic Danes. So a large proportion of the Greenland population is actually of ethnic Danish descent. There's a lot of intermarriage. Hardly any family in Greenland will not have family in Denmark. And about a third of the ethnic Greenlandic population actually lives in Denmark. So there's a lot of things where you could say, well, that's Ireland, isn't it? It's what we experience with Ireland and Britain, that there is all of this very close relationship. The difference, however, is that is one of scale. It's a very harsh environment, obviously, to have a full-blown society which expects the full complement of welfare services with a population of 57,000 people. So in a Danish context, we would say, well, this is even a small to mid-sized Danish municipality. And of course, it cannot run a prison service, a hospital service, a full-blown judiciary, all of that. And of course, that's not happening. And it will likely not happen in the very near future. So that's the Danish position. You may say that we will see Greenland as obviously a society that is too small to really be an independent state. The Greenlandic position will be very different. It will be aspirational. It will be one of saying, well, we may be few, but we can grow, we can build our independence step by step. And that is possible. Of course, if we go back 30, 40 years, a lot of the institutions that are now in place in Greenland would have been thought as unthinkable they now have a university, they now have a full-blown advisory institution for all its natural resources. It's able to manage a lot of the stuff that we would have thought in Denmark. They're never going to be able to do that. So the Danes have been surprised by the resilience of the Greenlanders. And we have also in that process been extremely arrogant in many ways. I have to say that the Danes have been, we have seen ourselves as gentle colonizers. But of course, we realize now that a colonizer is a colonizer, never mind the good intentions. And of course, a lot of what we have done as Danes in Greenland may have come with all sorts of good intentions, but it didn't actually fit the nation that was on the receiving end. So a lot of also bad blood has been in the process. I think the end of the day, what happened in the last year has brought the two nations really closely together, because the Greenlanders were sort of confronted with a harsh option, either go with the US or go with Denmark. Full-blown independence now was not on the table, would have been absolutely impossible. So you had a horrible decision to make. And in that situation, all the Greenlandic parties, without exception, and that is really important, came out with a joint statement in early January saying that given that hard choice, we go with Denmark. We are not giving up on the real benefits that have been won in the last 40 years of home rule. And if we just gave up now and went, perhaps lured by a dollar invitation saying, well, you can have maybe $100,000 each for your vote to join the US, that would be a horrible betrayal of generations to come. And that sort of really carried the vote and brought people out in the streets in Nuuk. I have taught a couple of times at the University of Nuuk, and it is obviously very, very difficult to maintain all the independence that you want if your population is so small. You need to depend on good friends. And the Greenlanders have been shown themselves to be extremely welcoming in terms of bringing in not only Danes, but at the University of Nuuk, a fantastic international community. And that sort of is true wherever you look at what's going on in Greenland. It's sort of very, if I hear the newspaper stories, people talking about the Inuits, and it sort of exoticizes Greenland in many ways. Greenland is a completely modern society, has all the welfare benefits and all the social expectations that you would have in any affluent Western European country. And that needs to be taken on board. So, yeah.
Yeah. What about Trump's logic? Because Trump's logic is that someone bad could come around and invade Greenland and take it over. So the United States better invade and take it over to prevent someone else coming and taking it over.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is where I think we need to be realistic about defense. It is very much a military logic that is behind all of this. I was really, really pleased today to see that NATO is now signing up to the Arctic Sentry, which will actually mean that we have a very strong commitment by the major European countries and the US to establish an Arctic defense mission in the high north. That actually, I think, changes the agenda, because up till now, Trump has had a point. Greenland could be the soft underbelly of the North Atlantic. With NATO now and the US as part of NATO actually signing up to building this Arctic sentry mission with tens of thousands of soldiers, that changes it, and it sort of makes Trump's threat of taking on Greenland null.
But Dan, what we're hearing there is very good, but I wonder, does NATO have any real viable future, given that Trump is not a reliable ally when Trump is threatening to invade your own alliance, and he doesn't really seem to be on the right side when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and it doesn't seem to be a leader who you can trust in any kind of alliance.
Well, no. Why would you trust him? But I suppose there is Trump himself, and that kind of the J.D. Vance part of the administration. They love to thumb their nose at Europe. The American national security strategy is to support basically far-right parties within Europe. They've talked. They have a racist discourse of civilizational erasure in Europe. That basically, if you have non-white Europeans moving in, this is the decline of European civilization, and that's basically their views on Europe now. We've seen in Trump's first administration, and now that he loves to thumb his nose at Europe. He likes to see the Europeans scramble when he says things like he wants Greenland, but then he'll back off. So
does he not look foolish when he does that? Like, do his own supporters not think, well, a month ago he was telling us we were going to take Greenland, we must have Greenland, we were definitely having Greenland, and then he backs away?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he has little shame personally, but also I think that in a way this is maybe taken as a sign of strength, as a bully's sign of strength in a way that because you can see that when he says this stuff, the power that his words have, and the way that it makes everybody try to scramble to to find a solution that will suit him and that will keep the U.S. on board. So it's performatively showing Europe just how much Europe still needs the U.S. and how much the U.S. is really in charge.
Mairéad, do you think Europe and the EU is doing enough in its response, say with Venezuela and say with Greenland? Because I can kind of understand the two sides, that you do still have to deal with the United States, and you are maybe hoping that in 3 years' time things might return to a more normal way of doing things. But there has been some criticism that perhaps people have equivocated in terms of how they respond to what's happening.
I mean, on Greenland, he achieved more rapidly than Europe would have done it otherwise. So in one sense, while his words were very harsh, it did get a reaction, and you just pointed out the reaction. So it's pushed Greenland and Denmark closer together, and it's also made the European Union strengthen its commitment on the ground there. So while I don't like the language and rhetoric, it is interesting that things happen after it. I would rather that Europe was more proactive, but on a few issues, including Greenland, we haven't been. We haven't been on security and defence. I think we've really, every time I stood for election to the European Parliament, going back to 2004, if you mentioned security and defence, it was EU army, our neutrality is at risk. And so I don't think in Ireland we've had a good discussion about what does security and defence mean. And particularly now where we have had an ally that we were closer to than we are today. On the Venezuela, I think you were quite polite, and so was the EU statement, because I think there was a feeling, and it was 26 member states that signed the statement, not 27. There was a feeling that nobody likes the Maduro regime, but nobody liked what happened. How do we criticize this in a way, or comment on it in a way which fell between two stools, really? So I think you're probably making a good point. It would be great if we could have been stronger, but what would stronger look like, and what impact would stronger have when we were not able to push enough? And this is why Europe, I mean, if we are to be a player globally, we do need to be much stronger, including on these types of interventions where we have the backbone to follow through, not just a comment or a statement. So I think there is that. But then foreign policy, is very much, sometimes the member states have different nuances. They might agree in general, but have different nuances. So that hasn't helped either. So I would forgive, in a way, the reactions. I mean, it caught everyone off guard. I mean, the idea of capturing Maduro and then the cameras and all the reaction around that. And it is about resources. It's about wealth. It's about money. And everything that you see happening around you is literally about money for some at the expense of others. And I would rather that Europe had a stronger voice when it comes to foreign policy. But again, I think we need the leaders to sit down, and they will be tomorrow. They're talking about competitiveness, which is really important. But I do think we need to talk about where does Europe see its place in the world? When we talk about our values, what are we prepared to do to defend those values? Or are they just words? And at a time when it seems that there's a huge erosion of values and civil liberties and freedoms, that if Europe isn't that beacon, who else will do it? And that's why I referred to Mark Carney's speech. It really cheered a lot of people up that there was this voice speaking to what we feel, and urging that these middle powers do come together and are stronger together, but not shouting. And we don't want to do the same as what the US is doing. But my biggest worry, and I think it was addressed by others, is that we are perceived in Europe to be a problem for the US, that they don't like the European Union. I mean, remember some of the earlier remarks that we were set up to screw the US? Does anyone recall that headline, which was like, wow, that was news? Does anyone have history in their minds when they'd say something like that? So it's also about liberal, freedoms. And I mean, there's a huge amount of nasty things going on behind the scenes. So, yeah, I think Europe can be criticised for all of that. But where do you land it? Is it the Commission? Is it the Council? I mean, where is it the Parliament? If you look at the European Parliament today, when I was there, it was fragmented, but not as much as it is today. And this is also part of the problem for Europe, that across member states, not only do you have different electoral cycles, but you have different combinations of government. And getting, consensus across that variety is really, really difficult. And we see that in Ireland as well as in other member states. So I take the thing about criticism, but I'm not sure what the solution is unless and until we get a stronger foreign policy view from the European collective union.
Michael, you mentioned the Mark Carney speech. Mairéad has mentioned the Mark Carney speech. Is there a sense that for years we were very comfortable in our belief in the international rule of law and this rules-based order, and in a way it has been upended because we're returning to a world where might is right, and where if you have the force, if you have the power, you can take whatever you want and you can do whatever you want, and you don't really, as Dan was saying, you don't really need to justify it anymore because you can just get away with it. And that's fairly depressing then, to think that that's the way the world is going.
I want to respond to that, but I want to make one point based on what has been said before. So I think one big problem when we speak of the kind of tendency of the Trump administration to denigrate Europe and treat Europe as this awful place, it's a real problem. I think that as far as I know, nobody in the upper echelons of Trump world has ever lived in Europe, has ever spent time as a student or a young person in a European capital or something like that. They really don't know what they're talking about. But to what Mairéad was saying about the response, the weak response, in my view, by Europe to Venezuela, not only was that problematic in terms of, if you care about international law, you need to stand up for it, because international law is not static. It is largely an evolving system of rules and norms that is based on what states understand it to be, what they perceive it to be. So when you are silent or when you acquiesce in the face of blatant violations, you are contributing to a changing of the rules. So that's the problem for international law. But from a more kind of practical spot, so this links it back to Mark Carney. Think about the contrast between how Europe and Ireland responded to Venezuela, statements of concern, and how they responded to Greenland, where they got their act together and made a much stronger statement. That's good on the one hand for reasons we've talked about, but think about how that's perceived by all of those middle powers or small powers in the global south, who Mark Carney is urging Ireland and others to make common cause with. They see Europe only finally waking up when it's European territory that might be on the chopping block or in Trump's sights. And they see this double standard playing out again here from European leaders in that difference between how the response to Venezuela was handled and how the response to Greenland was handled. Okay, to your actual question. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Daniel said. The big change here isn't that the U.S. has always been a perfect state when it comes to international law. Far from it. And we all know that. And that's what Mark Carney talked about, too. We've all lived with this fiction because the benefits of that fiction outweighed the downsides. And the real difference here, Daniel used the word brazenness in how the U.S. is explaining itself. And that's right, because even in the past, when the U.S. tried to push very controversial positions and essentially was violating the law, they would try to justify it in the language of law. And in so doing, even though that argument might not have been persuasive, they were in a way reinforcing that same system. If they take the time to try to make a legal argument, even a somewhat ludicrous legal argument. I mean, think about the way the U.S. tried to justify the invasion of Iraq, or going back to the Noriega abduction from Panama. They tried to justify this in legal terms, and sometimes more successfully than others.
Sorry, just
what we have
in there.
now is no attention to
And
it.
just jumping in there, it was Bill Barr, a young Bill Barr working in the Attorney General's office, who drafted the memorandum for justifying the invasion of Panama and that was used then by the Trump administration to justify Venezuela. And of course, Barr in between had been Attorney General for Trump in his first administration.
Well, Bill Barr would be part of the old school Republicans who at least understood there was some value in international law, even if it was a very kind of instrumental, self-serving way of approaching international law. And yeah, so they found interestingly, the Venezuela operation took place on January 3rd. The Panama operation also took place on January 3rd in 1990. So that's a bad day to be a foreign dictator. But yeah, so they use that, but there are significant differences between Panama and Venezuela from a legal perspective. But that's the best that they could do.
Dan, do you think there's any way of the United States going back? Because it sometimes seems that when these shifts happen in terms of foreign policy and they kind of become the new normal, that it kind of creates a new mindset in how foreign policy is judged.
Well, I think the problem is at this point the Republican Party, because the Democrats still believe in a lot of the older American ways of doing things. So if you get another Democratic administration, you might have a temporary return. But if the next Republican president is going to be a J.D. Vance, it could be even worse than Trump in a way. So, and then that goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of just the reliability of the U.S. That even if we survive another 3 years of the Trump administration and we have some Democratic president back in power, how do you know that in 4 more years it's not going to be J.D. Vance and we're going to be back at it again with all the same stuff we're living with at the moment?
But how do you deal with the bully? Because the things that have seemed to work best are not when the person stands up to him, but maybe when they try and flatter him and hand a letter from the king inviting to but it does seem to work better than the direct approach.
Well, flattery can work, but actually, I think in the case of Greenland, what worked? I mean, I think it was hard power. It was the Europeans saying, like if it's gonna be a trade war over Greenland, then it's gonna be a trade war, and you're gonna be hurt too. And by the way, we own a lot of the U.S. treasuries, and if you want to have high interest rates and a bad economy and all the rest of it, then that's where we're going to go. So I think it's that. I mean, that is the only language that Trump ultimately understands. You can flatter him and distract him, to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, for someone who believes that only might makes right, you have to show some might of your own. And fortunately for Europe, Europe does have some of that might. If you're Venezuela, then you're in, I think, a much more difficult position.
Not getting the Nobel Peace Prize seems to weigh more heavily on his mind than has ever weighed on someone's mind.
And why would he even want the Nobel Peace Prize? It's a mystery. But yeah.
Well, he will keep invading places until he gets it.
Yeah.
But Paul, I wanted to ask you about where do you see, and we'll open it up to the floor and have some questions, but what do you see as the future of Greenland? Where do you see Greenland in 50 years' time?
Well, I'm not the right person to answer that question. Obviously, it's for the Greenlanders to decide. That's been repeated over and over again. So I think that's number one. I think Greenland and Denmark has learned a lot, and the Faroe Islands, actually, the third party in the Kingdom of Denmark, and some of our Nordic partners. I certainly think that Iceland got shrilled down the bone when Trump suddenly started talking about "I want Iceland," and just kept on saying Iceland, a nice piece of ice, of course. I think I want to speak to a Nordic context rather than a Greenlandic context. And in a Nordic context, it's obvious to me that what is happening is really a sense that we need to get our act together. We have, since World War II and probably way before that, we sort of were comfortable under the being shielded by the US and acting as small states on our own and sort of ducking our heads all the time. It's certainly no longer the case. With Sweden and Finland joining NATO, there is a real sense of the urgency of the need to stand up for yourself. There is definitely a growing sense of Nordic unity, which could be seen as an attempt by the Nordic countries to move from small states into becoming a medium-sized power, which we will be if we get our act together. So I think that's the real potential. Will Greenland want to be part of that? I think they probably will. I don't see Greenland going down the line with the US now. I think that door has completely shut now, and people who are speaking for that are seen in Greenland as really betraying the national cause. So I think there will be a sense that at the end of the day we belong with the other Nordic nations. How that will shape up, well, it's for them to decide.
And Mairéad, before we throw it open, a quick question about the forthcoming European presidency. We talk a lot about European values, and we've been having a lot of discussions internally in Trinity about European values. Do you have any advice for what we in the Hub, what we in Trinity, or even what we as a country could do to show that we are championing those values, that we want to protect them against those who are challenging them and trying to undermine them, that we stand for democracy, that we stand for truth against disinformation, and that this is something that involves all of us, our young people. It's about education. It's about showing that we are part of this greater community of nations, and we are proud of that community.
So I won't give you advice straight up, but maybe after. But it strikes me that, and I would have always found this, when you say we stand for values, I mean, we know in our heart and soul that we can be challenged on how we've actually stood up for our values, and maybe your reference is one of those. But still, we have these values, and I think we need to now work on how we strengthen them. To my point where I mentioned that I'm troubled by the lack of debate or deep discussion on topics that are really important for Europe and for Ireland. We just get your view and his view where there's a clash. So I tend not to listen to as much current affairs debates, because I want to get more into the detail of the conversation like we're having here tonight. I think universities need to do more about getting young people engaged in these debates. I mean, I was young once, I vaguely remember it, and we used to have good debates. Was in a different institution, UCD, give a shout out. But I think we really need to have that. And I do think there's an appetite amongst people in Ireland. In other words, this room was full across to hear these debates about Greenland, about where we may be falling down and how we react, and trying to understand, which I may have explained badly, but the difficulty for Europe to find consensus on very hot topics like Venezuela, because there was a conflict. I mean, they didn't want what happened because of the whole international law thing, but they didn't want to come out and say, leave Maduro alone. So it was a really a caught moment. But I think Europe has its principles. We have these standards. And maybe the only advice I would say is have more of these discussions about how do we as citizens, because I'm an ordinary citizen now, how do we actually help leaders and politicians at home and elsewhere to give them the freedom or even the flexibility, the space to have deep discussions with their colleagues around the table and come to conclusions and sell it back home. And I think this has been the difficulty. I think we saw it with the Mercosur trade agreement, where, I mean, there was great hope. In my view, was necessary because, as I said, we need to have more trading partners, not just for the business, but for the connections and the relationships. But if you're not going to then make sure that it's communicated effectively, then you have the results that happened. And that's just one example. And I'm sure there may be others, and you saw what happened in the European Parliament. So I think that where do we have the time for these discussions? I mean, you're doing it. I think other universities need to do it. And I think around even my own community, people want to chat to me in detail about this. Frankly, how many of us in the room, maybe you all did, talked about Greenland ever before in this detail? I mean, I was in the European Parliament for 16 years and in the Commission for over 4. And I never had these conversations. I knew where it was, but I didn't have this. So in a sense, we're all being educated. And, you know, I don't want to say this, that it'll be misquoted, but we have been forced to do things because of the headlines that we probably should have done anyway. I'm not proud to have to say that, but on the other hand, let's take it and let's work with it. And let's also see what do we need to do in other areas before we have to read a headline that forces us into do it. And the one thing is I'm passionate about it, and we don't talk about it enough, is money. And I mentioned Capital Markets Union and the investment in Europe and unleashing the potential of what we have here. And that's really down to member states really having to make tough decisions to allow these things happen. So maybe you could crack that one for me.
Excellent. Well, look, I do think that perhaps is a good note on which to end our discussion tonight. Just to say that we have a wonderful event coming up on the 5th of March, where the world famous, renowned economist and analyst Jeffrey Sachs is going to be in conversation with visiting research fellow Catherine Zappone, who I'm delighted to see here on. It's organised in partnership with the School of Religion, Theology and Peace Studies here in Trinity. And I think that will be a very interesting discussion. So please sign up for that. But just to say our thanks to the John Pollard Foundation for making tonight possible, but a special thank you to our wonderful guests, Professor Dan Geary, Professor Paul Home, Professor Michael Becker, and Mairéad McGuinness, who has given up her time, as they all have very generously, and really enlightened us. And it has been an enlightening evening, and we've been very grateful to all of you, to Katrina, Christina, Aoife, and Ricky for doing such brilliant work on the organizational side, and to thank all of you for coming for what I think has been a very reflective and significant evening. So thank you all for coming.